Sunday Seminary Online. This is our second week in our study of the Elijah and Elisha stories in the book of Kings. So the first time that we met together last week, we talked about the role of prophets in the ancient world and in Israel more specifically. And today we'll discuss the particular prophets of Elijah and Elisha, but we'll really talk about their historical and literary location. So we'll talk a little bit about the book of Kings, what's it all about, what larger complex of literature is it a part of, and what was happening really at the time that Elijah and Elisha burst onto the scene. It really is a bursting onto the scene, by the way. When we start next week in 1 Kings 17, Elijah is just going to kind of appear, and he appears almost without any explanation of who he is, as if we already know him. He probably was an extremely famous character in ancient Israelite sort of oral tradition, but in the book of Kings, it seems like everyone's already supposed to know who he is by the time he shows up. But in any event, today we'll talk about the time and place at which he emerged, but also the piece of literature that is the book of Kings into which he emerges. So, setting the stage a bit for Elijah's emergence. So last week, as I said, we talked about prophets, how prophets work in the ancient Near East, but also more generally in Israel. We'll talk a little bit more about prophets today, but I ended by saying that prophets embody, within Israel, embody God's call to covenant fidelity, fidelity with God's covenant, and calling the people, especially the people in leadership, who have power and have some sort of control, or at least are supposed to, have some kind of control over society and over the economy, over military power, and so on, calling them to exercise this covenant fidelity, to remember God's covenant call, and to help others and empower others to follow it. So I'm going to move my little screen here for a minute. So, Israelite prophets, there's a few different words for Israelite prophets that we can find in the Old Testament. The word that we use in English, prophets, comes from the Greek word prophetes, which means to basically say something out or speak out about something. And that's not a word that comes from ancient Hebrew. The ancient Hebrew words for prophet include navi, that first word there. That V is pronounced a little bit like a V, actually. So navi, which that's the general word for prophet. It means someone who's called out to do something, who's kind of called to be given a task. But there are other words that are used to describe prophets. Choseh is one. Samuel is called a choseh, which is the word for seeing something, but not with your eyes. It's more like seeing a kind of spiritual sight, kind of like how Samuel is a prophet who can figure out where Saul's lost animals are in the book of 1 Samuel. So in any event, the idea of kind of spiritual sight, being able to see things spiritually, is part of that name. There are also prophets that are sometimes called ro'eh. Sometimes prophets are called both of those, Choseh and ro'eh. I think Samuel is actually called both. But the idea of ro'eh, that's another word for seeing. So they see things kind of spiritually. But then there's this other category of prophet, which often does not overlap with that of Choseh and ro'eh, and that's Ish Elohim, which is Hebrew for man of God. So you can think of it like this. Think of like the court prophet Nathan. Nathan lived and worked in the court for David, with David, was able to challenge David on some things, which was really an interesting and unique part of ancient Israelite prophecy, that prophets could stand up to kings and hold them to account. You can think of Nathan putting his life on the line when he accused David of murder and adultery. And instead of killing him, which is actually what most ancient Near Eastern kings would have done, if someone accused them, even if they were guilty of them, they would have gotten rid of the evidence. If you think of what people in ultimate power often do, right? So when Nathan confronts David, he confronts him in this parable, right? In 1 Samuel, and 2 Samuel, I'm sorry, and kind of stands up to David and accuses him. This is, I think, what is so special about David. David isn't good even most of the time. He actually does a lot of very bad things. But when he is confronted by God with his shortcomings, he often does actually own up to them, which is a strange thing for an ancient king to do. So in any event, all to say that standing up to kings was a crucial part of all Israelite prophets, it seems. But there was this extra dimension to certain prophets Nathan doesn't do any miracles. He just says stuff that God tells him. Another suggestion about these kind of prophets, so Isaiah or Amos or Jeremiah, they're not seen often doing miracles. They don't perform miracles. They know things and they say things, and maybe they perform signs or something. So Ezekiel does some strange things or sees some strange things and tells about them, but they don't do magic or miracles, things that break the laws of nature and make people surprised, right? But certain prophets do, and they are called Ish Elohim, the man of God. These are the prophets that break the rules of physics, that heal people, that do these miracles. And they often aren't the ones that have lengthy books named after them. So Elijah and Elisha are both described as in Ish Elohim, a man of God. What this kind of prophet is it's more like a portal through which God's enormously powerful presence can intersect with the world. This is also dangerous. Think of a nuclear power plant, right? God is so powerful, and that's what holiness really is supposed to mean, kind of an ultimate power that God has. But that is dangerous. Moses can't look at God's face, right? You can't be in God's presence directly without endangering yourself. All these stories about people touching the ark and dying and so on. It's not that God hates these people and is punishing them. It's that God's power needs to be respected in some way, but also God is dangerous. God is dangerous because God is powerful and holy. Just like a nuclear power plant doesn't hate the people if there's some sort of error at the computer, in the computers of the power plant or something, and something goes awry. It's not that the power plant hates the people that work there and kills them. It's that there was some sort of eruption of power that was uncontained and that people cannot come into contact with. And this is the idea of the presence of God. So in order for God to be actually present, there have to be these mediators. The temple is one of those mediating spaces. Priests are mediators. And in the prophetic world, these Ish Elohim, those are mediators of God's powerful and sometimes dangerous presence, but also God's powerful intervening presence. So in these stories, we see Elijah and Elisha both do powerful and sometimes strange things. We also see them do things that break our ethics. So we'll talk about how Elisha calls down these bears to eat some kids. It doesn't seem to fit our notion of ethics and what's right and wrong. It doesn't seem to be what Jesus would do. But at the same time, Jesus does and says some strange things too. All to say that sometimes God's power erupts through these prophets in ways that seem strange and otherworldly, but also sometimes the power of God erupts through these prophets in ways that bring life and fullness and rightness into society and into a particular time and place. So all to say that that's one of the things we'll come back to again and again is how is God present in the midst of these prophets, and how is it different than, say, Jeremiah, someone who talks a lot and who can hear God, but someone who doesn't have any special powers. Okay, so one of the things about Elijah and Elisha is that both of their story cycles, which are connected, so we can say the kind of one full Elijah-Elisha cycle, starts in the book of 1 Kings, chapter 17, and it goes all the way through to 2 Kings, chapter 9. Now, Elijah in particular is mentioned a few times in other places in the Bible, especially by Jesus, and by other people who are talking about Jesus and people who are talking about John the Baptist. But within the Bible, the stories of Elijah and Elisha fall within the books of 1 and 2 Kings. And actually, I should tell you that 1 and 2 Kings are not two books. They're one book, just like 1 and 2 Samuel is one book, and 1 and 2 Chronicles is just one book. There are some other books in biblical traditions that are named 1st and 2nd that actually are different, like 1st and 2nd John. Those are two very different letters. They're not just parts of the same letter. But 1st, 2nd Kings, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Chronicles, those are all just one. Kings is one book, Samuel is one book, Chronicles is one book. The thing is that scrolls, which is how these were originally written out, they're probably first written out on papyrus, like little pieces of ancient paper. Then they were kind of constructed into giant scrolls. And the scrolls that they used in the ancient world were made of leather. They were made of parchment, so like a part of animal skin. Think about a giant leather jacket, how hard it would be to write on it, and how expensive it would be to write a book on a leather jacket and then roll it up, right? And carrying that thing is actually kind of hard and is difficult. These scrolls, if they reached a certain size, they would have to break them up and write them on two different scrolls, because they would stitch the leather together, and eventually it would just get unwieldy. So you'd start not a new book, but just the part 2 of the same book. So think of 1st, 2nd Kings as really Kings Part 1, Kings Part 2, and the only reason that they're any different is precisely because they got too big to fit into one bound book. With all that said, 1st and 2nd Kings are also not a book in and of themselves that make sense. So if you start the book of 1st Kings, you run immediately into the stories of David, right? It's kind of almost a strange thing. I'm going to move my little screen over here. But it's almost a strange beginning, because it begins with the end of David's life. 1st, 2nd Samuel tell us about the life of Samuel and Saul, and then David busts onto the scene. And much of 1st, 2nd Samuel is about the life of David. 1st, 2nd Kings starts with David's death, but David dies 2 chapters into it, right? And then there's kind of a succession fight that happens after that. And then starting with 1 Kings chapter 3, Solomon really takes over as king. And then Solomon is king until 1 Kings chapter 11. And then 1 Kings chapter 12, Solomon dies, and the kingdom is split. So this is it kind of continues this saga, really, of David's family, but then that saga goes away, and the book changes very much in tone. If you read chapters 1 through 12 of 1 Kings, it looks and reads like a history of David's family. Not a history, it reads like a kind of an insider tale about David's family. And then starting in 1 Kings 13 and 14, there's some stories of prophets, anonymous prophets that come in, which are a bit unusual in tone and how they work. But then you start to get into kind of just some bare bones information about kings. So you go from these kind of long and very detailed stories about David's family and Solomon, and then you get into this stuff about anonymous prophets, and then you suddenly go into what reads a lot like an ancient chronicle, not the book of Chronicles, an ancient chronicle, which was like kind of like ancient history, but told in a very bare bones fashion. And it was really just to keep some information for the king. This would have been for the king's archive. So, for example, in chapter 15 of 1 Kings, verse 9, in the 20th year of King Jeroboam of Israel, Asa began to reign over Judah. He reigned 41 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Maacah, daughter of Abishalom. Asa did what was right in the sight of the Lord, as David had done. So you can kind of see that there's this kind of historical account that's trying to date when these kings are. The kings of both the northern and the southern kingdoms are dated here. And then there's this concern for the queen mother, which is only of interest in Judah's information. Apparently the northern kingdom didn't care about this so much. But every queen mother of the southern kingdom of Judah is named, and it's a fascinating document of their power. They must have been very powerful for their names to be recorded like this. But then there's always this kind of like evaluation, like did they do right or did they do wrong? So, for example, in chapter 15 of 1 Kings, verse 25, Nadab, son of Jeroboam, began to reign over Israel in the second year of King Asa of Judah. He reigned over Israel 2 years. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, walking in the way of his ancestor and in the sin that he caused Israel to commit. This is a reference to something we'll talk about in just a moment, but just notice that this person is being evaluated. Those evaluations in the book of Kings always have to do with whether or not they follow the 10 commandments. That's it. Are they following the commandments? And especially the first commandment, don't have any other gods before Yahweh. So this is a fascinating thing, because other ancient chronicles don't judge kings like this. This is only found in ancient Israel, that they're also being judged on some text or something that isn't from the king. Mostly kings get judged on whether or not they're powerful, they're important, they win victories in battles, how long did they reign, did their kingdom last for a long time after them, did they leave it in a good situation, did the people like them? Those are all of the things that ancient kings typically feel like they're getting judged about. We know this because when they write defenses of their reign when they're about to die, they usually explain all these things, right? They never say, and by the way, I was a goody two-shoes and followed, a very specific law that my God sent down. They might say I built lots of temples for my God, and I treated people well and things like that. But this judgment about the kings that we find in the Book of Kings is very specific about whether or not they're following the Torah. Whether or not they're following the Torah of Moses. The stuff that Moses got in Exodus and the stuff that Moses talks about in Deuteronomy. Did you do that? And it's particularly the Deuteronomy stuff. There's lots of the judgment language and the kind of analyzing of whether or not kings did what they were supposed to do in the Book of Kings. It really has to do with the core of the theology found in the Book of Deuteronomy. And I'll explain some of that in just a minute. But so, just to summarize some of the stuff that I've already mentioned here, we do find royal propaganda in 1st and 2nd Kings. This is royal propaganda that sounds a lot like royal propaganda from the rest of the ancient world. It sounds like Egyptian royal propaganda. Here we see Pharaoh beating some foreigners up with a giant mace, with a wing over top of Pharaoh's raised hand. That's the wing of the god Horus, who is helping Pharaoh and giving Pharaoh power to be able to dominate Pharaoh's rivals. This is what kings like to depict themselves doing in the ancient world, protecting their country by dominating rivals and foreigners with their power and their might and their protection of their god. That's not exactly what we see in a lot of kings, but we do see these passages where that's basically what they're saying. So some of this stuff about Solomon sounds a little bit like propaganda sometimes, but then also it's amazing that the Bible is also critical of these kings. So, all to say, there is some royal propaganda. We'll come across some of this in our stories, but some stuff that clearly looks like it was written to puff up these kings. But then, at the same time, there's stuff that's there to take them down a notch, too. We can also say royal chronicles. Royal chronicles are different from propaganda. Kings would make propaganda like these images that you see of Pharaoh up there, but also stories and carvings, and they would make inscriptions and things in order to puff themselves up and make them sound good, the best king of all, and so on. But royal chronicles, as I mentioned before, are different. They're just these bare bones historical accounts of kind of what happened. What year did this king take rule? What big things did the king do? Not in a propaganda sense, but just this king built this thing, which you might be familiar with, and this king did this thing over here or conquered this land and so on. It's kind of an account of what happened during a king's reign and an attempt to keep time and kind of chronology. These are supposed to be so boring that in the book of Esther, the Persian king asks to have these royal chronicles read to him when he has insomnia in the middle of the night, so he goes back to sleep. But when I was just reading you, like Nadab, the son of Jeroboam, began to reign over Israel in the 2nd year of King Asa of Judah, that's probably from a royal chronicle. And some of these are actually referred to. So sometimes you'll be reading the book of Kings and it'll say something like, well, if you want to know more, look in the Chronicles of the kings of Judah, and that there's probably some more information about some of those kings and what they did there. So fascinating stuff, but we don't have access to some of those ancient books. This right over here, this tablet that I've got an image of there, that's an actual ancient royal chronicle from Babylon. So we also have another source over here. I'm going to move my little head here. And another source is prophetic stories. When we read 1 Kings, we've got some Chronicles stuff that I just read. We have some royal propaganda stuff that we can definitely see in the first 11 chapters. We have some stuff that's critical of them, which I'll talk about in a moment. But then we also have these prophetic stories, like in chapter 13, a man of God, an Ish Elohim, one of these prophets that I mentioned, not Elijah or Elisha, just a different one of these kind of powerful prophets, comes and does amazing things and performs miracles, which you can read about if you read 1 Kings 13. But this story and other stories like it about these prophets seem to form a particular layer of these texts. So these stories describe Elijah and Elisha, this part of these prophetic stories, but they kind of interweave with the royal chronicles and the royal propaganda to make the book of Kings. And there's one last thing, and I'm going to move my little head here just so you can see it well, and that's Deuteronomistic theological commentary, which sounds like a mouthful, but let me just say this. The book of Deuteronomy is very clear about a few things. The first is that there is one God. There is one God. So if you've heard something from Deuteronomy, it's probably Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4, the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone, or the Lord is one. Yahweh is one, right? This is like the main proclamation. Jews repeat this prayer more than any other prayer. This is kind of the core of contemporary Judaism, but also ancient Judaism and the ancient religion of ancient Israel, as put forth in the book of Deuteronomy. So Deuteronomy says there's one God, and you can only have this one God. Don't put any other gods before, and it's our God is alone. Our God is one. So Yahweh alone theology. Don't worship the other gods. This is a big and important part of Deuteronomy. But also Deuteronomy says there's one Israel. That is, there may be a time when there's two kingdoms, but Israel's supposed to be one. It's supposed to be unified. And Israel will always be one family, one community. But also that one community doesn't just mean that they all believe in the same God and that they all see each other as related. That one community also means that they're all working for each other and helping each other. Deuteronomy puts forth an amazing program to say that we should help the poor, we should help the aliens who are wandering around among us, we should help the orphans and widows, we should help the Levites, who are the poor people who work for the temple and so on. They're not the priests. The priests get a lot of food and a lot of accolades and so on. But the kind of lower class workers are the Levites, and they don't have much. And Deuteronomy says you got to give them something. Give them some food, make sure they're taken care of, make sure they have housing and so on, and make sure that you store up grain in your community so that people who are in need have access to that stuff. So Deuteronomy is all about there being one community, and that there's one right way of worship. So Deuteronomy, it's all about oneness, one God, one Israel, one community, one way of right worship. And that is the lens through which the entire book of Kings is really filtered and edited. So think of the Deuteronomistic theological commentary as being the main lens for the book. So what probably happened is someone, after the fall of Judah, because 2 Kings ends after the fall of Judah, that is during the Babylonian exile, right? So during the Babylonian exile, or slightly after, somebody found these sources or brought them with them. Maybe somebody working in the temple or somebody working in the palace, the royal palace, when these things are falling apart, getting destroyed by the Babylonians, somebody grabs a bunch of stuff and they leave. Or they know a lot of this stuff. They've memorized a lot of it. And they bring with them royal propaganda. They bring with them what the kings told their scribes to write about themselves, what David's family knew, and what the scribes who were part of David's community knew. And then we also have the royal crown, which is going to be favorable to David, right, generally, and David's offspring and these other kings and so on. So then we also have royal chronicles. They brought with them some of these records, ancient records that we kind of read, in the second year of King Asa's, reign and so on. So that kind of stuff shows up in these texts as well. And then they also probably brought the prophetic stories, either in oral form or in written form. And then also they brought with them their concern for Deuteronomy and their theology that was shaped by Deuteronomy. And they put together this long story, and Kings is only part of it. We believe that these people who put together the book of Joshua, the book of Judges, 1st, 2nd Samuel, and 1st, 2nd Kings, because all of those books are amazingly informed by Deuteronomy, over and against even Genesis and Exodus and so on. Somebody who was shaped fully by Deuteronomy, or a group that was shaped fully by Deuteronomy, had all these materials, and they assembled them into a history of Israel, but it wasn't a typical ancient history or modern history. It was very different in the sense that everything was filtered through this theological lens of the book of Deuteronomy and its concerns. So when a king gets judged in Kings, they're getting judged not based on whether they built cool stuff, they won battles, they made money. None of that matters. All that matters is, did you follow the Ten Commandments? And especially, did you worship foreign gods and try to convince the people to worship foreign gods? And also, did you do the things that Deuteronomy asks you to do about the community, right? Did you put the community first, and so on? So you can even kind of you can see this throughout the book of Kings. But you can see some very special examples, like, for example, Omri, who we'll get to in a minute. Okay, so just to fill you in a little bit about what happened just before Elijah comes on the scene. In 1 Kings chapters 1 through 11, 1 Kings 1 and 2 is really about David's death. It's kind of David's last will and testament. Starting with chapter 3, the story is about Solomon. And Solomon lives this like amazing, wonderful life, is a great guy in so many ways and is so wise, and also has tons of problems throughout. Creates problems for Israel and so on, and leaves behind a kingdom that is about to fracture, and leaves behind a son, Rehoboam, who in 1 Kings 12 doesn't take the good advice, treats his people poorly, and the northern tribes of Israel break apart from the southern tribe of Judah. And then also Benjamin is kind of like around here somewhere. But in any event, the 10 northern tribes, it's not really 10 northern tribes because is Levi with them? Levi's throughout. And anyway, the tribes are kind of a mess. But in kind of general terms, the northern tribes, like Manasseh and Ephraim, and all the tribes except for Judah and Benjamin, they form. They break apart. They go to war. They win some battles. They end up putting different people on the throne. That's Jeroboam. Ends up being the first king of the northern kingdom of Israel. And this is a kind of a huge shift in the history of Israel. The book of Kings continues to track both kingdoms, north and south. And the northern kingdom ends up falling in 722. And Jeroboam, the first king of the northern kingdom in 1 Kings 12. It might be good to read 1 Kings 12. It's a fascinating chapter. Jeroboam is the king that becomes king of the north. Rehoboam is Solomon's son who messes up and is king of just Judah after the split. Jeroboam ends up reforming worship in the northern kingdom. And he's a Yahwist. He worships Yahweh. But he starts to put these images of bulls places, probably as an image of Yahweh. Yahweh's associated with bull imagery throughout the Bible. Yahweh's strong like a bull. Jacob calls Yahweh the mighty one, which he uses the word abir, which is a word really for the bull. I mean, Jacob calls God the bull. So all to say, the bull stuff isn't what's bad. It's that Jeroboam seems to be worshiping differently than Deuteronomy says he should worship, but also that through these first kings of the northern kingdom, there's a different way of worshiping Yahweh. It's not that they stopped worshiping Yahweh. I mean, even Ahab and Jezebel, who are called like these terrible people and so on, they seem to support the cult of Yahweh, the worship of Yahweh. It's just that they also support the worship of lots of gods. So I don't imagine that, I imagine that Jeroboam, like all these other northern kings, loved Yahweh, but also thought that there were lots of other gods that they should worship and do obeisance to. Deuteronomy is very clear, one God. And David seems, at least as recorded in Samuel and Kings, David seems, with all his problems, to be very fiercely devoted to the exclusive worship of Yahweh. And Solomon, for all of his faults, seems to, at least at first, be interested in that. By the end, he starts to build temples for other gods as well. But the South is a bit more in the way it's told here in the Book of Kings, is on a knife's edge between kind of going the way of the North and worshiping lots of other gods, or sticking to the loyalty that David and Moses tried to instill. So this is kind of like the way this story is told here. There's a lot more to say about Deuteronomy, and there's lots of scholarly theories about it. I'm trying to simplify a whole bunch here. But all to say that one of the other themes that you can see in this literature is the instability, the deep instability of the North. As soon as the Northern Kingdom splits apart, Jeroboam seems to do kind of a good job, actually, at first, of building a new kingdom and starting a new dynasty of northern rulers and so on. But then things start to fall apart. So if you take a look at chapter 15, 16, you'll see that the northern kingdom kind of descends into turmoil pretty quickly. So you'll see, for example, in verse 8, we have of chapter 16 of 1 Kings, we have Elah. So in the 26th year of King Asa of Judah, Elah, son of Bashaa, began to reign over Israel in Tirzah. He reigned for 2 years, but his servant Zimri commander of half his chariots, conspired against him. When he was at Tirzah, drinking himself drunk in the house of Arza, who was in charge of the palace at Tirzah, Zimri came in and struck him down and killed him in the 27th year of King Asa of Judah and succeeded him. So there was a general, Zimri, who ends up killing the son of Bashaa, Elah, who was king, and takes charge. So then verse 11, when he began to reign, as soon as he had seated himself on the throne, he killed all in the house of Bashaa. He did not leave him a single male of his kindred or his friends. Thus Zimri destroyed all the house of Bashaa according to the word of the Lord. And then, if you go down to verse 15, in the 27th year of King Asa of Judah, Zimri reigned 7 days in Tirzah. Tirzah is the town where he had set up his shop. So he's this new guy who had assassinated the old guy who had only been who only been reigned for 2 years. This new guy only reigns 7 days. There's a civil war against him, and he ends up being killed, and so on. And then this guy Omri takes over. It looks pretty bad, right? If you have a 2-year reign of a king, and then a 7-day reign of the next guy, and then there's a civil war and some turmoil after that, the kingdom's not looking good, right? You're going to be taken over by somebody else, or something bad's going to happen, right? But what happens is that this guy Omri, a general in the army, takes over, and Omri actually becomes very powerful, builds a new capital, calls it Samaria. Here are some of the archaeological remains of that guy Omri's palace that still exist today in the ruins of the ancient city of Samaria, which if you visit Israel, you can see. So you can see some of the, actually over here, you can see some of the stone casings from the wall there. And Samaria was on top of a giant hill. You can read about the founding of it in chapter 16 of 1 Kings, verse 24 and on. He built this big city on top of a hill in order to not be assassinated, right? Because if you build a new city from the ground up, then you get to control everyone who comes there. You don't have like elders from different clans already living there who might want to kill you because you're the king taking their money from taxes, right? So he founds this new center of power, which is a smart move, kind of like David did with Jerusalem. He conquered Jerusalem, took it over, and made it his own city so that he could reign over Israel. So maybe Omri learns from him. But then Omri seems to be super powerful. Now, here's the really strange thing, is that Omri only gets a few verses in the Bible. But Omri, the historical king of Israel, was so powerful that all of the surrounding nations, including Assyria, the Assyrians, like the terrifying nation around, who was the power of the world at the time, they called the northern kingdom of Israel, they called them Bit Humri, the house of Omri, for centuries after Omri was dead. Ahab is part of Omri's dynasty. King Ahab, who marries Jezebel. This is during the stories of Elijah, right? Elisha ends up sending and crowning this guy Jehu king to take over and get rid of Omri's family. Jehu is called in a document that we have today. You can actually see this thing at the Emory, the basement of the Carlos Museum. It's a giant black obelisk, and it shows King Jehu of Israel paying homage to the king of Assyria, Shalmaneser. It's called Shalmaneser's black obelisk, and it says, King Jehu of the house of Omri. Jehu killed off the house of Omri in a civil war. You can't get further away from the house of Omri than Jehu, the guy who killed them. But they still call him the house of Omri because that's how powerful Omri was in the historical memory. So the Assyrians didn't know about Israel. They knew about the house of Omri. But Omri only gets 8 verses in the Bible. All to say, when you read Kings, you're not reading a history book like we would write a history book that spends a lot of time focusing on the powerful and the ones who win battles and all this stuff. No, the book of Kings evaluates these kings and gives them a lot of verses based on whether or not you can get something spiritual out of their story, whether or not it helps you to understand God, whether or not it helps you to understand who you are in light of God, who the community is, what we're supposed to be doing here. So Ahab, who's a bad king, gets a lot of airtime because Elijah's around with Ahab. So you can learn something about God by these stories of Ahab. Omri, it seems, you can't really learn much from. He was actually pretty successful and was a bad guy and died. So happy. He died old and full of years and, so you're not going to learn much from that story. So they just kind of gloss over it. So that's why I say it's really important that we're reading something that is it's historical in the sense that it lines up with some of the things we know about history, but it's not a history like I would write it or you would write it. It is framed by the theology of the book of Deuteronomy, and it's a lens through which everything is read. So I bring that up because Elijah and Elisha are so important for this group of people or individual who wrote this literature, what we call the Deuteronomistic history, the history books that were informed by the book of Deuteronomy. Joshua, Judges, 1st, 2nd Samuel, and 1st, 2nd Kings. The reason that Elijah and Elisha are so important to these people, and by the way, here's Assyria. I'll get to that in just a moment. Just to show you where Assyria is, the giant power which had started to move into what's called Aram, or the Arameans, which were the people who live in what's today Syria. And they started to make incursions into the land of Israel around the year 730s, in the 730s BC. So Elijah and Elisha lived before that, in a time when Assyria was a major power, but they weren't quite yet coming down into the land of Israel and threatening them. The major power that we'll see who's their enemy is Aram, and the Arameans in the stories of Elijah and Elisha. So in any event, just to situate us there. But these stories of Elijah and Elisha take place in 1 Kings 17 through 2 Kings 9. And the reason that Deuteronomy and the Deuteronomistic historians care so much about these two figures as opposed to others is because of worship. So it might be strange because Elijah and Elisha are not priests. They don't seem to care that much about the worship life of the people that they interact with. In fact, as we'll see with the story of Naaman, Elisha seems to kind of reject a lot of the presuppositions about ancient Israelite worship. Again, we'll get to that later. But the reason is because Elijah and Elisha stand up for one God. They love the idea of one God. There is one God, Yahweh. They may think there are other gods that exist. Elijah and Elisha aren't clear about that, but what they know is that if you are part of the covenant, part of the family of Israel, you better follow the one God, and there's one God for you, and that's Yahweh. So this might be surprising for me to say that I don't know that they were monotheists. I don't know that Elijah and Elisha believed that there was only one God who ever existed. The reason I say that is historically, I don't know that people thought that way at the time of Elijah and Elisha. I think that might have been a later innovation to be able to think that way, right? God works with people where they are, and God works with people with what they can understand. God didn't make ancient Israelites understand science, modern science. God allowed them to write the book of Genesis with the creation story sounding like other ancient Near Eastern creation stories, and that's okay because the point isn't science, the point is about God. So in the same way, history doesn't have to be written in ways that make sense to us in terms of history. We can still learn from it. But also, God meets people where they are, and God works with them with the kind of mental hardware and software that they have available. So in the ancient world, I don't think ancient Near Easterners, people like Israel and Canaanites and Egyptians and Mesopotamians, they were all polytheists. They just believed that there are lots of gods out there in the world. The question is, what do you do with that? So a polytheist, it kind of describes people who, this is a ancient Babylonian stela, by the way. This is kind of ancient Babylonian carving with all these different gods. Marduk, this is Marduk's image. The spade is Marduk's like little totem symbol. And then here's Marduk, this kind of like dragon-like thing. That's the god of Babylon. Here's Nabu, Ninurta, a cool-looking god. Nergal, another one. Anu and Enlil and Sin, the moon god. Ishtar, the goddess of war and wisdom. Shamash, the sun god. Ninhursag, Ea, Enlil, all these major gods of the Mesopotamian pantheon were seen to be kind of a family. They were related to each other. There was a hierarchy. There were higher gods and lower gods that had different jobs and so on. So they were all related to each other. But the idea was that you might have one god that you worship in particular, maybe a clan god or a god of your kind of profession. Maybe there was a god of your town. So if you lived in Babylon, Marduk was your main god. Even if you kind of knew that there were other high gods out there, you would focus your worship on your local deity and so on. If you focus your worship so much that you don't even talk about the other gods or care about them, that's maybe monolatry. This next stage here. So a lot of people in the ancient world, most people were polytheists. They believed you should worship lots of gods. And I think there were a lot of people in ancient Israel who thought that too. When Aaron makes the golden calf in the book of Exodus, he says it's about Yahweh. We want to have a festival to Yahweh. But then he says, here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of Egypt, saying there's more than one of them, but Yahweh's probably, in Aaron's mind, one of the big ones, maybe the big one. But there's lots of other gods too. And this is the problem. Aaron worshipped Yahweh. Aaron made that golden calf for Yahweh. Just like Jeroboam made some calves, right, and made them, put them at altars and so on in 1 Kings 12, and he made them for Yahweh. But probably made them for Yahweh and other gods. That's the problem, right? So that's this polytheism, the idea that you gotta do obeisance to all these other gods of the world. Again, a common idea. Another idea of the ancient world that you find in much fewer places, but it was this idea of monolatry, that you should worship one God, right? You believe, and you even sometimes you praise other gods sometimes, but you focus your worship on one God. And there were some people who did that. Then the next stage down here, henotheism, is really that like you only believe in one God in the sense that like you don't really even talk about other gods, right? You like it's more of a mental idea that you try not to think about the other gods. You don't say that there's no other God that exists, but you just only talk about your God, and you are silent about the other ones. But then the last stage there, monotheism, is describing when people say there is only one God, there has only ever been one God, right? Which is much less common in terms of the history of the world. We can see some clues throughout the Bible that ancient Israel was for the most part monolatrous or henotheist, something like that. In Deuteronomy even, Moses talks about how there's other gods out there, that Yahweh kind of lets other gods like play with other people, but that Israel is Yahweh's particular possession. Over time that changes. By the time we get to, say, the prophet Isaiah, we're starting to hear a little bit more about that maybe there aren't other gods that exist. So I think that Elijah and Elisha are people who were pushing Israel away from polytheism and maybe even monolatry towards something like henotheism. This was they emerged at a particular time in ancient Israel's history when there was a precarious hold of this idea that there was that you were supposed to worship Yahweh alone, and they were primarily responsible for pushing Israel towards worship of Yahweh alone. Or at least calling people to do that. So I can point to this a little bit. So the name Israel, Yisrael, at the end there, Yisrael, that means he struggles with Ale. This is often understood to be God. Ale is a Hebrew word that can mean God, but it often also means the high god of the Canaanite pantheon. This guy right here, whose name is Ale. Ale means, yes, that's right, it's confusing. Ale is a word that can mean a general term for God in the ancient world. It can also mean the name of the particular Canaanite god, Ale. I don't have time to get into this right now, but maybe sometime we will. But just trust me when I say that very ancient Israel borrowed names for Yahweh from the Ale worshippers around them. So, some of the names that you come across in Genesis. So, El Elyon, Ale Most High. That's a Canaanite name for Ale. And it was borrowed by ancient Israelites and put to use to worship Yahweh. But there was also this kind of uncomfortable, for some, kind of slippage between Ale and Yahweh. Was Ale pretty much like Yahweh, or was Ale another name for Yahweh, and so on? So all to say that that's like pretty murky in terms of ancient Israel. But look at the name for Elijah in Hebrew. It's Eliyahu. Eliyahu. So Yisrael means he struggles with Ale or whatever. The name Elijah means my Ale, which can mean Ale, like the name of the Canaanite high god, or it can mean God. My Ale is Yahu. Eliyahu. Ale means God. E means me. Eli, my God, is Yahu. Yahu is the short form of Yahweh. So my God is Yahweh. My Ale is Yahweh. Elijah's name is like a claim that was a bit like, that scene in an old Western, a gunslinger movie, when the guy kicks open the canteen door and like pulls out his gun and, like, I can't whistle very well. So Elijah's name is like that. It's a name that makes you say, if you say the guy's name, you're saying that Yahweh is your singular God. It's like fighting words. This guy's name is a fighting word. So we'll get to more of that next time when we talk about Ahab and Jezebel. But just to say that I think that this is why the Deuteronomistic historians, the folks who put together the Book of Kings, were so keen on these stories and placed them so profoundly and prominently. If you read 1 Kings all the way through, you'll read this long story about Solomon, a little bit about David, a long story about Solomon, a little bit about the breakup of Solomon's kingdom, a couple crazy chapters about how messed up the north was with all these assassinations and so on after the death of Jeroboam. And then it flows pretty much right into these Elijah and Elisha stories that just take over and dominate the story all the way into 2 Kings chapter 9 from 1 Kings chapter 17. Like, that takes you pretty much to the fall of the northern kingdom. So all to say, like, it's unbelievable how much space, how much acreage of text is given over to the Elisha stories. But I think it's because they prove such an amazing point. The kings aren't very good at teaching people things, at least after Solomon's time. They're good at teaching negative stories, but they need the prophets to teach the positive ones. That's at least the message that I get from the Deuteronomistic historians. One other thing is we'll talk a lot about Baal. Baal is the high god of the Canaanite pantheon, as I just said, which was really important for the Israelite people as something to push against, but also as a seductive force for them to worship. But there was another famous and important god of the Canaanite pantheon, the storm god. So Baal created things and was a general sense of order, but also Baal was understood to be kind of an old god, didn't have a lot of power left. You were supposed to venerate Baal. But sometimes in the stories of Baal that we actually have from ancient Canaanite sources, Baal will get drunk and not take care of stuff sometimes. But there was a young, upstart, very powerful god named Baal, the storm god. Baal actually means master or lord. It can also mean husband. It can be the particular, so anybody who's like in charge. Ancient Hebrew people would call someone Baal if they were talking to a master. And it's a word that some in the Bible and other ancient sources, some women would use to refer to their husbands in the kind of unbalanced patriarchal system of marriage and culture in the ancient world. So, master or lord is the word that they could sometimes would be attributed to people in power. But also, it could be the name of any deity. Yahweh is sometimes called Baal in the Bible, not to confuse with this Canaanite deity, but just because Yahweh is the Lord, right? There's a word Adonai that means Lord in Hebrew, but there's this other word Baal which also means Lord. So sometimes Yahweh is Baal, right? That just means Yahweh's the master. Yahweh's in charge. But it also can mean this very particular Canaanite god. So when you read Baal in the Bible, it's just a word that means master. But when it's clearly referring to a bad god or a Canaanite god, that's actually the god Hadad. They don't use the name Hadad in the Bible. They don't like it. They don't want to use it. But also, ancient Canaanite people tended not to use that name. They tended to use this name Baal, which it's like a title, like captain. But Hadad was the name of the Semitic storm god. And this storm god was super powerful, energetic, sometimes got in trouble, kind of jumped too quickly into things in the stories that we have that exist of Baal. So you can imagine that ancient Israelites really liked this kind of like powerful, active deity. And in fact, they borrowed some of these ideas about kind of describing Yahweh, some of the religious language that they use in the Bible. They borrowed from Canaanites who were trying to describe Baal, just like they borrowed some language like El Elyon to describe Yahweh, their God, their high God. So the creator God. So it's kind of like the Israelites were saying, hey, when you talk about creator gods, that's our God. And when you talk about the active storm god, that's also our God. Our God brings storm and rain. Our God brings kind of agricultural fecundity. Our God created the world. Our God does it all, right? It's a bit like Martin Luther borrowing, the kind of the organ music of the day, right, and kind of slapping his own lyrics to it. The ancient Israelites were borrowing this stuff from the people around them and saying, "What I like that hymn you're singing, but I'm going to replace Baal in there with Yahweh." And in fact, Psalm 29 is a psalm. It's a hymn written to Baal, the Canaanite storm god. We know because Baal fits really well in the lyrics. But they took out Baal and they put in Yahweh and they changed a couple things. And then they ended up with an awesome Israelite hymn. Psalm 29 is great. It was originally written to praise Baal. And Israelites borrowed it, changed it, and made it their own. So all to say that this competition between Yahweh and Baal is a big deal, was a big deal in the ancient world, and is a big deal in these stories. So the Phoenicians are Canaanites. By the way, Canaan means purple, and Phoenike is the Greek word for purple. Canaan, Phoenicia, exactly the same word, just two different cultures. And by the way, none of those people called themselves that. No one called themselves a Canaanite. No one called themselves a Phoenician. In fact, they called themselves a resident of Tyre, which is an ancient city, Tyre, or they called themselves a resident or a person who lived in Sidon, another major city, or Byblos, or Carthage, another major Punic city, which is Phoenician. So all to say, they were called purple because they sold purple dye, which was rare in the world. But there's a murex snail, a little snail that lives in what we would today call Israel and Syria and Lebanon, and you can take in Palestine, and you can take the snail, crush it up, and make a rare purple dye out of it. That's why everyone called them the purple people, the Phoenicians, the Canaanites. So Jezebel comes from Phoenicia, or from Sidon and Tyre and so on. She's a Canaanite. She loves Baal. It's not bad of her to love Baal necessarily. It's like she grew up doing that, right? She's not being mean. This is what she does, right? If you're a Canaanite, you're supposed to worship these gods. So all to say that this is a cultural conflict, but also a cultural conflict that people probably wouldn't have understood if they were new to Israel. I mean, the fact that Israel said, we only have one God and you can't worship other gods, that would have seemed crazy to so many people in the ancient world. I mean, of course you have one God that you worship. Everyone does, but you're not telling me you don't allow worship of the other gods that are out there too. What are you telling me? I can't worship my local God? Even the Babylonians didn't tell, when they took them in exile, they didn't tell the Israelites they couldn't worship Yahweh. They said, great, worship Yahweh. Also, you might want to do some obeisance to our God Marduk, right? But yeah, sure, worship your little local junk god if you want, right? So you can imagine that when these Elijah and Elisha stories start, they really focus on this conflict over not whether or not Yahweh is God. No one's arguing about that in these stories. That what they're arguing about is Yahweh the only God? So we'll get to that when we talk about 1 Kings 17 and 19 and so on. But that's the main question. Is there only one God? So here's the Canaanite pantheon. Here's El. Here's Baal, an image of Baal, the storm god. He's got like a fiery lightning bolt here. He's on top of the clouds over here. He's called the Cloud Rider. Here is Anat. So these are, kind of gods and goddesses of ancient Canaan. And you can imagine that, like, some people just want to put Yahweh as, like, one of these, many gods that you can come across in the Canaanite pantheon. Elijah is there to say that's not the way it works. What Deuteronomy said, he doesn't ever talk about Deuteronomy, but what the Deuteronomic historians kind of, the way they frame these stories, it's almost like Elijah is saying, hey, you forgot, we have one God, one and only one God. Eliyahu, my God is Yahweh, singular. Okay, so that's basically this kind of like world that Elijah is bursting into, and we'll talk more about the details of this when we get into 1 Kings 17 next week. I'll look forward to talking about that text. So we're going to focus on just that text next time. That's, we're done with the big world setting here, and we'll move into just reading particular texts next time. So look forward to seeing you all then.